Welcome to the Same Team Marriage Large Group. We're so glad that you all are here, and welcome those of you joining us online. We are so excited. This is night 2 of the Same Team Marriage Large Group, but the good news is that there is not a prerequisite of coming to night 1 to enjoy the evening tonight. It's going to be great. We have our speaker back, Jason Van Ruler, tonight, who is an amazing licensed counselor, therapist extraordinaire, and he's going to be sharing tonight about conflict, which is a really wonderful topic tonight for people to be riding home in the same car together. So that's going to be really, really nice. So here's the goal for the night. One, take notes and, be filled up by the information that we get tonight, but also don't let a topic of conflict start a conflict in your marriage. It'd be really, really helpful. So I'm really, really excited to continue on in this. I know that conflict can be a hot button issue. A lot of relationships involve conflict. I was thinking about this though. I don't think actually my marriage has ever had a conflict in it. I was talking to my wife about it. She disagrees. She thinks we've had one before, but I don't think we've ever had a conflict in our marriage. So, but we're going to learn a lot tonight about this. And let's see, I had one thing to share with you. So throughout the evening, you might have questions that come up in your mind about, hey, maybe this is a topic that I need him to hit on, and he hasn't talked about it yet. Maybe he's talked around an issue, but it wasn't specifically what you wanted to hear about it. So we have a solution to that. We actually have a phone number, 97000. You can text same team to 97000, and you'll get a link to a form that you can fill out to type in your questions. So if you have a question specifically for Jason, we would love to hear those questions. So again, just text 97000, same team, to that phone number, and then you'll be able to fill out a form with a question on it. And actually next week, we're going to talk about intimacy. That's the final night of the large group, but half of the time, we're actually just going to be answering your questions. So we want to make it really, really practical. So again, 97,000, same team. You can text that word to that phone number and fill out the questions. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Jason to join us to talk a little bit about conflict. If you would, put it up for Jason as he makes his way up here. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you. Well, you guys had me back. I'm a little surprised, but I'm glad to be here. So thank you very much. Last week was fantastic, and I think last week was kind of a good start for us to kind of talk about some things that are going to be factored in tonight with conflict. But I think probably what's most important for me to tell all of you before we talk about conflict is that as a married person, I'm going to be a little bit of a hypocrite tonight. Okay, and I just want to put that out there. I'm going to talk about a lot of things that I think are the right things to do and the things that I've learned are helpful. But I want to be honest in the sense that I don't always get it right. So if you hear me talking tonight and you think to yourself, man, I don't do any of this stuff, I just want to let you know, neither do I sometimes. And I have no good reason not to. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about this stuff, and I want to make space for the fact that you might not be doing this already, and that's okay. This isn't an urge that you have to get it right, but hopefully what this does is gives you some conversation and something to build off. But just know as I'm talking that I know a lot of stuff about this, but I'm just like you, I don't always do it right either. So as we start to talk about conflict, I think it's always really important to look at Scripture and to kind of take what Scripture has to say about conflict and see how that applies. And so I like to go back to Hebrews. It says, work at living in peace with everyone and work at living a holy life. For those who are not holy will not see the Lord. And what stands out to me about this is the word peace. And I think the word peace is really important in our relationship or our marriage, because that's really what we're going for. Having a lot of conflict and being in a state of crisis is not healthy for a relationship, and it's really, really hard to live there. And so tonight, the first thing that I want to talk about is kind of living peacefully and recognizing that we don't actually always need to have a conflict. Sometimes we really want to, but we actually don't need to. So probably the first thing that I would tell you is that most conflict can and should be avoided. Okay, and so I'm not encouraging you to do the Midwestern avoid conflict thing. If you're already doing that, you actually probably need to have conflict. But what I am saying is that a lot of times what we need to think about is, do we really need to fight about this? And there are times where it seems like you really need to fight about this, but you don't. And some of the reason is we don't think about it long after the fight, or it's not really that impactful and it wrecks a day. So one of our first things to think about is, Do we really need to fight about this, or do we need to pick a different direction? There is a place here in Lake Jackson, Texas, where the building, the city designer came up with all these really cool roads and intricate roadways and just wanted to be different. So he made the whole city of Lake Jackson just different. And after kind of creating all these streets that were new to people and designs that they hadn't seen, he talked to his secretary and he said, "Now I need to name the streets. What should I name them?" And she's kind of ticked at this point because she wasn't really in on the whole brilliant thing. And so she said, "You've made all these streets going this way and that way. What do I care? Just name them." And what I love is the guy's really literal, right? Like most of us. So he just named them. This way, that way. There's a church that runs, or a street that runs by a church called His Way. He just ran with it, okay? But I think this is a good reminder for us because sometimes when we're confronted with conflict in our relationship, we got to decide if we want to go this way or that way. Okay, and sometimes we go this way when we really shouldn't be, and we do it for the wrong reasons. And so I want you to just kind of think about sometimes in your relationship, which way do I go the most? Right? Am I a this way person or a that way person, and should I be more of the other, or is that a good balance? Now, most of the time, you should probably go that way. You should probably go away from the conflict because it's probably not necessary, but not always. Sometimes we need to get into that. The next thing that we want to understand about conflict is what the role of that is in our relationship. Okay, because conflict serves a function. And it's not just to see who's tougher or who's better at arguing, but it actually serves a relationship function. And so something that I've noticed, at least in a lot of couples where they have some trauma or wounds, is that sometimes it can feel totally spooky to get too close to your spouse. Right? Like you're married, but like then you get vulnerable or you let them in on something that you're struggling with and it feels weird. And so with that feeling, then it can lead to conflict, strangely. And the reason it leads to conflict is because it's spooky to be too close, and so the conflict works to kind of put distance between the two of you. And so one thing to kind of look at is this conflict about putting distance between us, or is it about something else? I know for me, sometimes when I've had the most conflict in my marriage has actually been after a time that we handled a hard situation particularly well. And it seems odd, but for me, if we do something difficult like a death or something like that, we handle it really well as a couple, my knee-jerk reaction is actually to put space between us when I shouldn't be. And so I want you to think a little bit sometimes when you come into conflict, is this about putting space between us or is this about something else? Because if it's about space, we probably need to do some work on ourselves and avoid that. The next thing we want to look at as we're kind of sizing up if we should have conflict is how much of that is related to our current feelings. I think a great example of this is I work with an organization in Nashville, Tennessee, and I love going down there. It's become kind of a second home. And a couple of years ago, they said to me, "Jason, we want to have all the spouses come, and we're going to have a big staff retreat." Okay, so I'm pumped, mostly because like they have Jenny's ice cream and all these cool places that we can eat at. And so I get Jody to agree to come, and we get on the plane, leaving Sioux Falls. And I don't know if anybody else flies often, or used to maybe, but I always do this thing when I'm waiting for the plane where I kind of size up the pilot. You know, it's kind of a weird thing, but like I want him to be old enough, but not too old, and like look a little grizzled, but not too grizzled. And so this particular day, I'm looking, and I see a pilot that to me looks like he's like 15. Sitting there. And so I'm kind of nervous already. I'm thinking like, this is not going to be good. But I'm excited to go. So we get on the plane. It's one of those really cool small planes where you feel everything. And so one row is like 2 people and the other one's just 1. And so I was in a seat in front of Jody on the 1 row. And we're told at the beginning of the flight, like it's going to be just a normal flight. Everything's fine. We're flying to Chicago. And we get a ways into it. And all of a sudden, the plane drops. And I'm not talking like, oh, that was kind of scary, but I mean like it dropped so much that the little old lady flight stewardess in front of me hit her head on the ceiling. So she hits her head, there's like sodas rolling down the aisle, people are screaming, we're sure we're gonna die. And because I'm always 13, I'm laughing. Like to me, this is hysterical that I'm gonna die this way. But I'm just like, this is statistically, like this is amazing. I cannot believe this is happening to me. Jody is not laughing, though. She's not laughing at all. So I kind of pull it together, and I'm like, wait a second, maybe I got to be mature about this, even as I die. And so I hold her hand, and we kind of start praying, because it's like we're going down, because the plane is shaking, right? And in that moment, I'm thinking about like everybody close to me, and I'm thinking about my kids, and I'm thinking about all this stuff, and I'm so overwhelmed with feeling, okay? And what happens is, this is the storm. So Jody took this out the window. So this is the storm that we're going through. And after a couple of minutes, it just stops, right? So we go from like this weird scene in a movie where everyone's screaming and we're dying to then just quiet. And in that silence, it's like all that emotion is still there, and I'm overwhelmed. And then we land a couple of minutes later, and after we land, this nervous kid, and I just knew this was going to happen. Remember, I called this 15-year-old kid comes over the intercom. I think he's sweating because he's like, well, he's real amped up, as he should be. And he tells us that what he was trying to do is go around the storm, but he missed, got a little too close to it. And so he's sorry. And I'm like, well, I peed my pants, and I'm sorry about that as well. So we're all sorry about something today. But in that moment, I felt relief. So I went from like this I'm going to die to then followed by this relief that like is unimaginable. And then I'm ready to get on another plane. And so I think if we're not careful, like our conflict is like that, where in the moment, like in that plane, I would have done anything because I thought my life was over, right? I would have made any rash decision. If someone would have said like, hey, do you want to put all your money in Powerball today? I'd be like, yeah, why the heck not? Who cares? I would have done anything. But then the plane landed. And things changed, and then I wouldn't have done that. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful sometimes on going on how we feel too much, because otherwise what happens is we make a decision like we're going to die, but we don't. And we make a decision like our relationship's over, but it's not. And so we just want to be careful. Are we responding to the feelings, or do we need to give them a little time? Next, I think the thing that we have to look for is, are we having a fight, or are we going to have a fight about what's fair? Now, this is like one of my favorite things to see clients for is the fairness fight. Really, really love it. I have a little abacus that I use. We keep track. It's totally cool. We work it out, who wins, who loses. I'm kidding. I don't do that. Because we can't. And a great example of this is that at my house, this is actually my dinner table, we have what's called the best spot ever, okay? And the best spot ever is right there. And I would like to think that the best spot ever is that way because I sit right here. In reality, the best spot ever is because it's easiest to get to and it's closest to the TV. So it is totally the best spot ever. And so for my 3 kids, every night you want to be in the best spot ever. Like there's other spots, but we all know the best spot. And so we have tried really, really hard as parents to keep it fair, okay? But the problem is like we just eat all the time. So it's really, really hard unless we have a pen and a paper to keep it completely fair. And so sometimes my kids are totally benefactors of the unfairness, right? They get the spot 2 times in a row or 3 times, or they don't get it that day. And in the end, it kind of works out. And so the lesson there is that we have to look at our relationship and say, does it have to be fair? Is it always fair? And am I sometimes the recipient of the unfairness? Because the reality is we are, right? There's some times where we get things or we get to do things that in the scheme of things are really wildly unfair in our relationship. And so we have to be careful not to engage in a fight about what's fair unless you really are going to keep track of everything. And that's just kind of weird unless you're like an accountant or something and that's a hobby, but it's just not super helpful to do. So I would just tell you probably don't, okay? So we want to kind of look out for that. The other thing that we kind of want to do is think about giving our partner grace. And what I mean by that is we all know who this is, right? This is Keanu Reeves, okay? He's awesome. Everybody knows that. He is like a saint on earth, apparently. I've never met him, but I think he must be. And so Keanu like donates money to charity, and I think he like kisses babies and does like really amazing stuff that none of us do in here, okay? And so I want you to think about something. What would happen tomorrow if you woke up and you went to CNN and you saw that Keanu had robbed a bank, okay? What would you think to yourself? Would you think, well, that Keanu's bad news. I always knew that about him. He's a bad guy. No way. You'd do what I would do, right? You'd be like, well, the bank probably had too much money. It's not Keanu's fault. You know, like Keanu's a good guy. It's not his fault. We would give him grace. The thing, though, is how often do we do this with our partner? How often do we look at our partner and say, like, no, they're they're great. Like, I love them. That's why I married them. And so they get grace here. Instead of just deciding that they're bad or they made a terrible decision, do they get grace? And so this is a weird question to ask, but do you give your partner as much grace as you do Keanu? Because if you don't, you probably should. I mean, Keanu is great, but still, you're not married to him. So these are kind of all things we want to think about as we're kind of looking into conflict. Now, I think as we start to kind of assess and we move into the next level, what we really want to pay attention to is our expectations, okay? When people come in and they talk to me and they have like 100 expectations, I always think that's cool, but you're always going to be disappointed. And the reason for that is like people can't hardly meet their own expectations sometimes, and so if we impose like 100 on people, the chances are they're not going to hit it. And I think as an example, God seemed to nail expectations in 10 or less. So I think that, if he could do it, we can probably shoot for that too. And so you just have to kind of caution yourself, is this about my expectations? And are my expectations actually valid? They could be, right? There's room for that. But there's a lot of times too where what we think is an expectation is actually just a want. And wants are important, but they're maybe not something we need to fight about. Okay, so let's say you go through all this and you decide that what you want to do is you want to have a fight. Okay, so we're here, we've agreed, we've gone through kind of this whole pre-flight checklist, and we're going to duke it out. What we want to do then is when we realize we're in conflict, we want to slow down and think our way out. Okay, now you'll notice I'm not saying feel. Feelings are important, but they're not an especially good guide in conflict. Feelings often get us in trouble and lead to a place where we can't resolve things. So we want to think our way out. Next, when we approach conflict, we want to realize that sometimes conflict is in fact necessary. I used to work at a staffing company, and I managed the place, and so that was great for me. We had a dispatch counter, and so everybody would kind of come by this dispatch counter, and they would check in every day. It was really the hub of the whole place. And so one day we got a delivery of safety equipment. And the delivery driver said, "Hey, where do you want me to put this?" And I had no idea. I really didn't. And so I said, just put it wherever. And so where he put it was right in front of the dispatch counter. Okay, so it's a big stack. So first day, I don't know, I'm lazy, I don't really care, so I just leave it there. Second day, I do the same thing. Third day, I think you see where this is going. Weeks go by. But as the weeks go by, what starts to happen is people trip over the boxes, they're kind of in the way, but we just learn to walk around them. Okay, so we leave it this way until my boss comes, which is usually a time where you would pick up the boxes, but I don't. And so he walks to the door and he trips on the boxes and he says, "Why are these here?" And what's weird is that they were totally in the way, but I just left them there for so long that I didn't even know anymore. Those are just the boxes that we walk around. And what I see a lot of times in relationships when it gets really bad is that they have boxes of stuff that they just didn't know what to do with, and so they leave it. And then there's another box and another box until pretty soon it's hard to even see your partner anymore, or you trip over it and you get hurt. And so what I would tell you is don't be a person that just ignores the boxes. Even if you don't know what to do with them, figure it out. Because otherwise those boxes get stacked up and it gets really, really difficult to figure out a way out. And so that's the thing that I see is that it's not good to stack boxes. So if you have a box, take care of it. Deal with it. We also want to realize when we approach conflict that we can't run away from it. All right? So this is a picture of the back of my house. My grill is right here. There was a huge, nasty hornet's nest there. And so what I did, because this is just kind of who I am, I did not deal with it. I would go out and kind of do that thing where you sneak under the hornet's nest to grill my hamburgers and then sprint inside. And they would kind of duck at me and I would scream. I'm not going to do that for you here. But I would do this. And so this went on for a couple of months. And finally I decided I had to deal with it. And so I got that hornet foam or whatever, that can of stuff that is completely useless. I swear, honestly, just a side note, I think America's Funniest Home Videos helped design that because they're this is going to be great. You're going to spray this foam and then nothing will happen, videotape it. I don't know if that's the case. But for me, I went out, I took this can of foam and I shook it really well and I sprayed it at the nest. And I don't know what I expected to happen, maybe fireworks or their heads would blow off or something cool. But what actually happened is a hornet just like popped his head off and like shook his head and was like, no way. And I just met eyes with this hornet and I'm like, I'm totally screwed, right? Because in this moment, this foam did nothing. And so the hornets came out and started chasing me. And I did what any grown man would do. I screamed, I jumped off the deck, and I ran through the yard. And then I jumped over my fence and I ran into the neighbor's yard, because this is, of course, what you would do. But somewhere in my neighbor's yard, three houses down, I realized something. I actually live in this house. So like I have to go back there sometime. Like I can't just move into my neighbor's yard, right? Like I literally have to go back there. I would like to even grill someday. And so that realization is kind of the realization we have in our relationship sometimes, is like we just can't run away forever. If we have a conflict or we have something we got to deal with, like it can be big and scary, and maybe we need help, or we need like a crappy can of foam to spray at it. Don't do that to your partner, actually. It makes them really mad. Tried it on Jody, didn't like it. But we got to deal with it, okay? So we can't just run away. So then let's say we're not running away, and instead we are participating. What we want to do then is we want to kind of think of it in terms of jujitsu. And you look at me, and I know everybody thinks, like, this guy does jujitsu. Like, this guy is scary. He could beat people up. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you thinking that, because you're absolutely right. I'm kidding. So it occurred to me that my son and I, we needed to do something together. And so I came up with this idea that what we would do is we'd take lessons. And so I talked to him, and we decided we wanted to do jujitsu. And so jujitsu essentially is grappling. You try to choke someone or break their arm. So like it's a good thing to teach a kid, in my opinion, that's developing, as to how to do that to people. And so we took it and actually have loved it. But what I learned from that is that every time that we have a lesson, we do training and technique, which is great. We always end the lesson with what they call rolling or sparring. And so the point of rolling is that we get close, right? And we practice our technique because we both want to get better. And then if someone starts getting hurt, we stop. It's actually tap out, or as we say, tap, tap, or take a nap, which is, fitting for this. So we want to think a little bit about our relationships. When we have conflict, we want to use it to get close, to improve ourselves and get better. And if someone starts to get hurt, we want to stop, okay? It is no fun if you break your partner's arm the first go-round, right? They will remember that. That's not cool. They will not do that with you again. So what we want to think about is just, if we're going to live together and make this work, we got to stop if someone's getting hurt. Okay, the next thing that we want to kind of be aware of in conflict is that we have to keep it clear. I have this super annoying habit of telling my clients that if they can't make their fight into a tweet, like if they cannot explain what the fight is about in 40 characters or less, it's too big. And that always is met with resistance. And people say, well, Jason, you don't understand. It's about these 14 things. And I'm like, that's cool, but you'll never resolve that. So if we are going to have a fight, we got to be super clear on what it's about, okay? And if we can't be clear, then we need to take time to figure out what it's really about so we can be clear to our partner. We also, when we're looking at this, want to recognize if we're being a butcher or a surgeon. And I say this because I think sometimes we approach it like a butcher. And what I mean by that is, a butcher, their job is not to actually keep something alive. Their job is just to cut stuff. And so they don't have to be super careful. They don't have to make just a precise incision. What they do is they just sort of hack away at stuff. And I'll share with you guys, I didn't know anything about conflict coming into my marriage, and so I wasn't very good at it. But somewhere along the way, I learned this. Like, I learned to be a butcher. And I'm not proud to say that. I'm just telling you, because if you're that way, I want you to know you're not the only one. But I kind of learned that if you were going to have conflict with somebody, the best way was just to chop them up. Just say hurtful things, do hurtful things, just make it so that it's over. And the thing is that when you do that, like, you wound your partner in a way that doesn't heal quickly, right? Because they remember that. And so if we're going to have conflict, what we want to do is we want to be surgical about it, right? Because the thing about a surgeon is that they do operate, right? There is cutting involved, but they cut on the part that is infected or needs to be removed, and their goal is to keep you alive. And our goal in our relationship is to keep it alive, not to kill it. And so we want to think about that. Also, when we're in conflict, we want to make sure, again, that we don't let our emotions get the best of us. Because if they do, the chances are we won't make a great decision. And so clinically, we talk about this as getting flooded emotionally. And so maybe you've heard that. But it's kind of that moment where like your emotions get so strong that you're not thinking anymore. Totally great example of this. I used to work right across the street from here. And so one day I'm standing outside, and there's like these two Honda Accords like racing through the streets, and they're yelling at each other. It's clearly like a road rage thing. And they pull into the parking lot of the Sunshine Foods. And both guys get out, and they're like middle-aged guys, khaki pants, plaid shirts, and they're yelling at each other, right? And they have like super specific, hurtful things that they're yelling, which are hilarious, right? And so people start to kind of like gather around them, and because we're all high school kids at heart, so we're like, fight, this is gonna be so cool. But what happens is that as they yell at each other, they start to get flooded, okay? And so the insults that like initially were like spot on and really funny turn into just weird things, like your khaki pants are too short or your hubcap's missing, and everyone's like, well, that's getting strange, like I don't know what that's about anymore, but they're getting flooded. And so eventually what happens is it turns into that weird thing that guys do when they're gonna fight, where they just sort of bounce off each other and make weird noises. Okay, and so we're all like, oh, I don't know what's happening, but it sounds weird, and I think someone's gonna punch somebody. And the truth is, they were just both flooded, right? They were completely overwhelmed with anger. And what's so cool is that a lady came up right out this door, and she had her groceries, and she was just like not having it, right? There's all of us gathered around, like, this is so cool, there's a fight. And this lady just looks from her car, and she's like, hey, you idiots, stop fighting. And they just like stop. And they look at each other. It's like the spell was broken, right? They're like, oh, I'm doing this. This is strange. And I think they even shook hands because they were like deeply ashamed of what just happened. But I think if we're not careful, like we do this in our relationship, right? It starts off kind of logical, like we're going somewhere and maybe going to work it out, and then it just gets kind of like weird and insulting, and then it just gets to be weird grunts where we need someone to yell, hey, stop that. And so when you're in conflict, if you start to become the guy in the khaki pants and plaid shirt who's commenting on your partner's hubcaps, it's maybe good to like call it for a bit. Take like an hour off or something and decide what you really want to say. So that's important. I think also it's really important when we're talking about conflict is to make sure that our goals are in line with our team. Now this, my mother helped me. This is, I'm sure you can tell, soccer star Jason right there. This is obvious to everyone. I played soccer as a kid, loved to play soccer, still play old man soccer sometimes. And I'm a midfielder. So as a midfielder, we don't score very much. That's okay. It's just not really part of it. And so I decided somewhere in this game that what I really wanted to do more than anything was score, okay? And so when the ball came to me, I just took it. Now, I had players around me, but I was like, I'm scoring because this is totally what I want. So I take off, I'm on a fast break. People are yelling. I'm imagining they're cheering. So I'm like, this is so cool. I'm sprinting down the field. It's kind of like clearing out. All of a sudden, like I must be faster than I thought because there's really nobody around me. And I run up to the goal, and I'm like, that guy looks familiar. Like, is that guy in my chemistry class? Doesn't matter. Take the best shot of my life. Make the goal. This is amazing. I slide through the grass. I almost take my shirt off, but I'm in high school, so that's not something I'm going to do at that time. So I keep my shirt on. I'm cheering, and I look around, and no one else is cheering at all. In fact, people are like really, really quiet. I'm like, did you not just see that? That was awesome. They did actually see it. Because I scored on my own goal, okay? And so I had gotten so caught up in what I wanted, which was to score a goal, that I forgot what was good for my team. And so I hogged the ball, and I made a run for it, and I shot, and I scored this goal, and actually cost us the game. Like, we literally lost because I did that. It was a sweet goal, though, but still, we lost. Now, I want you to think a little bit about conflict. How many times do we do that in our relationship? Right? We kind of get blinded by like the thing that we want that might not be best for us, and we go for it. And maybe people yell at us, or maybe those people on the sidelines are actually even God saying like, hey, what are you doing? This isn't about us, this is about you. And we don't listen, and we just shoot, and we just kind of celebrate, and then it hits us. And so when we're in conflict, we want to make really, really sure that it's about the team and what's best, and not just for us. So, okay, we had a fight, we're working through it. Now what do we do? Well, we want to rebound quickly because our marriage depends on it. If I could tell you one thing that's really paramount, in conflict in couples is your rebound time. And what I mean by that is how quickly do we process through and get back with life? Because the longer that takes, the more problematic it is. A good example of this is the Yeti cooler. Okay, I financed my house. I bought a Yeti cooler. I was really excited about it. We're still making payments. And the reason I did that is because the Yeti cooler keeps stuff cold forever. I think literally there's stuff from last year in there right now. And it kind of struck me that some of us are like the Yeti cooler after a fight, right? We put it on ice for a long time and we don't deal with it. We just kind of let it sit in there. And if we're not careful, we just let it sit in there for a really long time. And so if you're a Yeti cooler, man, that's awesome, but it's also not. Because probably what we want to be is a little bit more like just our fair mid-range cooler that keeps things cool for long enough to deal with them and process, but not forever. There's also kind of another side of this, which is that we don't want to be a styrofoam cooler. I'm kind of a styrofoam cooler. You could tell me that you hate me and that I could go jump off a cliff, and 5 minutes later, I'd probably be like, what? Do you want to hang out later, or what's the deal? That's actually not good either. Okay, so if you're a styrofoam cooler, which sometimes guys are wired this way, where we have a fight, and maybe you hear me and you go, yeah, you're talking to me, Jason. But you have a fight, and you're like, hey, do you want to hang out? And your partner's like, no, actually, I thought you just said we hate each other. And you're like, yeah, but I'm a styrofoam cooler, so I forgot already. And they're like, yeah, no, I didn't. So sometimes we want to work to kind of see that we need to be in the middle and not just on one end. Okay, other things about rebound that we want to focus on is trying to see our partner's motivation. Now, I have to say that some complete animal did this. This is disgusting to me. This is actually a cereal box from my house. I will be eating this in about an hour and a half. Eat your heart out. It's going to be great. But somebody ripped my box up. Now, why did they do that? Because they want the sweet, sweet chocolatey goodness too, right? But the way that they approach it is like an animal. And so we're going to talk to our kids about this. But what I'm telling you this for is because we can usually connect over motivation. We might not connect over action or execution, but I can connect all day long with my kids about how good this cereal is. I just wouldn't open it that way. And so if we're trying to rebound, sometimes what we want to do is we want to look at our partner and try to understand what they were trying to do. Maybe you don't agree with how they did it, but if you can agree with what they're trying to do or see it, it makes it easier. Other things that we want to notice are just that sometimes what we need to do is own our part and then walk away from it. I think this is really important, so I'm going to read it to you real quick, but it's a poem by Portia Nelson, and it's called There's a Hole in My Sidewalk, and the hole is conflict in my mind. And so number 1 says, I walk down the street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk, I fall in, I'm lost, I'm helpless, it isn't my fault, and it takes forever to find a way out. How many of us have had conflict like that in our marriage or relationship where we just completely fall in and it stinks? 2 is, I walk down the same street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk, I pretend I don't see it, I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in this same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out, right? So we kind of act like we don't see it coming, and then we fall in again. 3 is, I walk down the same street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it's there, I still fall in, it's a habit, but now my eyes are open, and I know where I am, and it is my fault, and I get out immediately. So we start to take ownership of the rebound, and we say, I shouldn't have done that, I'm sorry, and we try to work towards resolution. 4 is, I walk down the same street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk, and I walk around it. Even better, right? Because again, a lot of these conflicts we don't need to have. And lastly, I walk down another street. And so that's kind of what we talked about at the beginning, is just getting to the place where you can maybe sometimes go the other way. Okay, so I think if we keep that in mind, that helps us. Another thing to kind of be cognizant of when we're talking about rebounding is grace and truth. Okay, so I'll kind of touch on this, and this is a huge topic, but we want to have grace, like the grace for Keanu or the grace maybe that God has for us, but what we also want to do is we want to have truth. Okay, and so what I'm all telling you tonight is I don't want you to just be so grace-filled that there's never a problem, because that's actually a problem in and of itself, but I don't want you to be so truth-filled that all you ever do is look for problems. I want you to have balance. And I always think of it like that's why we have 2 hands, right? Is one to hold grace and one to hold truth. And I think the church teaches us this first, is that to have the best relationships, we need to have both. And so as you think about conflict and rebounding and all these things, I just want you to think about, where am I on that scale? Like, do I do a good job of holding grace and truth, or am I kind of heavy on one and light on the other? Because if you can find balance, that's where the good stuff's at. Again, I think we're going to have some questions now. We'll talk about that, and I'll come back up after. Thanks. Yeah.
That was incredible. So we're gonna take some time like we did last week, where you and your partner can share. So we'll have questions on the screen. Online, you'll have some time as well. It'll be a total of 20 minutes. We have a few questions that you'll be going through for that 20 minutes. Then we're gonna come back together at the end. We'll have some pointed questions for Jason to wrap up, and he'll have an action step for us as we go. So we'll take 20 minutes. We'll talk with our partner, and we'll come back together. All right, we're going to come back together here. Welcome back. I hope things went well with your partner. So I have a couple of questions for Jason as we close out the night, and again, then maybe Jason will leave us with something. So my first question for you, I've always wanted to ask this question to someone who's in a professional kind of therapist mode. Maybe I should just see a therapist. What do you do when you know that you are right in a conflict? Okay, so you know you're right.
This is great.
Okay, and they just they disagree, but you know that you're right. You're for sure right. What do?
Isn't that enough?
Isn't that
enough? It depends.
Yeah.
I think you have to think about what the motivation is for proving it, right? So sometimes you are right, and that's fine. There's space for that. But how important is it? And then also, you got to think too about how your partner learns best. So sometimes we have people in our lives who we can just tell them something and they're really receptive. I am not one of those people. I have to figure it out on my own. So if you are right, sometimes the way to do it is to just be quiet then and just let them figure it out. And if they don't figure it out, it's okay.
And just let it go.
Just let it go.
All right, we'll see how that goes.
But for whatever it's worth, I'm sure you were right. Anytime you thought, I'm sure you were. Yes.
So the illustrations that you gave tonight were just so dynamite. One of my favorite was the boxes illustration. I think, I'm assuming, unless I'm just my relationship is totally rare, but I know what boxes that we just kind of step around. I'm not going to touch that one. If I touch it, it's going to be a fight. I've been there before. I know what that one is. What do you do with that? You know the box is there. You've been stepping around it for years. You don't want it to be a fight. What's a step toward moving that box or opening that box?
Yeah. I think just agreeing about what's inside. So sometimes those boxes, we don't even share a mutual agreement about what's in there, right? To me, it's this, and to you, it's that. Yeah. And so I think just one step is can we just agree what's in that box? And maybe open it up and look at it and say yeah, what's in that box is this. And we don't know what to do about it. So if we just focus on agreeing on what's in there, that's our first step. We don't have to try to fix it. We just got to agree to both look at it. Because one thing I noticed is over time, I didn't even look at it anymore, right? I just kind of wrote it off. And so I think if we agree on what's in it, we know who to ask to fix it.
So not necessarily starting with the conflict side of it, just addressing the facts. This is what I think is in this box. This is what I feel like we're stepping around. Do you agree with that?
Yep, absolutely.
Good. That's good. The other thing that I thought you said was really compelling is you said when you are in conflict, you are to think your way out, which is, I thought, interesting from a therapist perspective because we're supposed to feel things. When you do this, I feel this. I've heard different things like that. So talk a little bit more about what it would look like for me to think my way out of a conflict instead of share my feelings.
Right. Yeah. So feelings are important, and there's a lot of time and space for that. But they're actually not all that helpful in making decisions about relationships and things like that. And so what I tell people a lot of times is if your life is a car, feelings should be in the front seat, but thinking should probably be driving. Yeah. Okay? And I think sometimes in fights what we do is we let our feelings drive, and that gets us in a lot of trouble. It also sometimes gets us in love, which is cool, because that's, when you first meet somebody and those feelings, you can talk yourself into anything, right? You can be well, there's this glaring problem, but we're in love, so it's cool. Yeah. So there's a need for that sometimes. That's also why I love premarital counseling, because we're hey, this is a glaring problem. They're but we're in love. This is so cool. There's no issue. And then we get married, and then we start to realize that those feelings have to also be reconciled with thought. So I would tell you, let thought drive the car. Feelings can be a good advisor and navigator, but they shouldn't be the one driving.
So when we're in conflict and we feel like feelings are driving the car, then what?
We take a break. And this is really, really hard to do, but we just walk away for a minute. And we tell our partners, so don't be like me with the hornets. Don't sprint into somebody else's yard, because that's strange. Tell your partner, I got to think about this for a minute. Because I'm not my best self right now, and if I take a little bit, I think I could be better. And we do that.
And maybe setting up some ground rules, right, for what that looks like, because some people get really hurt or really offended based on experience, how they've maybe grown up dealing with conflict, things like that. And if somebody just walks out of the room, it's just like, well, I grew up,
triggering.
Some of that is triggering stuff. So really setting ground rules. Do you have any opinions or thoughts around setting ground rules around conflict?
Yeah, just narrate what you're going to do. I mean, it's really pretty simple. Like, say, hey, I'm going to go walk out. And I do this even in my marriage, and I think Jody gets a kick out of it, but I'm like, I'm going to slam the door, and I'm going to go in the garage and yell, and then I'll come back in here and feel embarrassed, and we'll talk. And she's like, okay, all right, I guess that's what's going to happen. So you don't have to have like a really well thought out plan for this. You can sometimes just narrate what you're doing, but it's helpful because your partner needs to know for those reasons, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, they go, he just left. Is he coming back? Does he still love me? What's going on? And so just tell him what you're going to do. And what's great is it kind of diffuses anger, because I can guarantee you when I'm like, I'm going to slam the door and scream in the garage, I'm like, I am? Okay. Maybe not,
that's the plan, huh?
Yeah, so sometimes just telling them what you're planning to do helps diffuse it too.
Yeah. That's really good. And I don't know if this was yours or something else, but the butcher versus the surgeon illustration, I just connected with so much, because I feel like I have the heart of a surgeon in conflict, but I might have the means of a butcher, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think that what I'm doing is fixing it, but I might be really hacking away. This is a gruesome illustration. Sorry about that. As we're kind of working my way through it. But it's still a good one, right? Because surgeons want to help, and surgeons want to get the bad out, the cancer out, whatever it is out, but they're kind of using. So do you have any words for somebody who has a heart of a surgeon but the hands of a butcher?
Yeah, use your partner as your guide, right? So look at them and ask them, how is this affecting you? Great question. I think I'm a surgeon. Am I? Right?
Yeah.
Well, you're a surgeon in a lot of ways, but not here. So just ask your partner, because they're going to be the best guide for you.
That's good. That's what I have questions-wise. I'm just going to hit one more time. If you have questions for Jason next week, we'll take some specific time to answer these specific questions. And man, dynamite content. So seriously, we can trust you with our questions. So again, text same team to 97000 with your questions. Do you got anything to leave us with tonight?
Yeah, I do actually.
Great.
So when I first started jiu-jitsu, my trainer, he still is, he's like 7 feet tall and huge. And so every time that I would go to spar with him, I would get really overwhelmed. And so much that I kind of get scared. And so one of the first things that he taught me was to live in that discomfort. And so what I imagine is that some people listening might be feeling like I did, like they're facing a 7 foot tall person who's just certainly going to beat them up, or it's going to be really bad. And I just want to tell you, like, it's okay to be uncomfortable, and then ask for help, okay? And so if you're feeling that way tonight, there are a lot of resources. Talk to somebody about that and get that help, but recognize that we all feel that way sometimes.
Do you have some of those resources? Is there anything specific that you could send us to at all?
Yeah, I think there's some good stuff. I mean, I think just what's close to home for us is, who do you know, one of the questions, who do you know in your life that does marriage well? Have you ever talked to them? That's a great first start, or pastors or counselors, and of course we can all help with that stuff. But first and foremost, do you know anybody who's good at this? And if not, how do we help you find somebody?
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna pray for us, and then we can head out for the night. God, we thank you so much for wisdom that comes from you. I'm thankful that we got to read your word tonight and hear what you want for our lives, and part of that is peace for sure. I thank you for the wisdom of Jason just pouring into our marriages tonight, Lord. And I just pray that you'd give us all the boldness to take some steps forward in the area of conflict. Also, would you give us so much grace going into these conversations? Would you just give us even soft-skilled hands as we work through these conflict together, Lord? We just ask for your help, your blessing on the most important relationship that we have on earth, and that's our relationship with our spouse. Lord, we love you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Can we put it up for Jason one last time?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a wonderful night.